actions that these characters do, they all surmount to this sort of notion of what I think is the centerpiece of Dostoevsky's entire sort of philosophy. And I think it's love.
Mm.
It seems so um, like saccharine and almost like kind of cringe if you for some people. Like I can imagine loads of people like, oh, I love, oh. But I think really the centerpiece of all of Dostoevsky's work is centered around love and what it means to be full of it and what it means to lack of it in great, great destitution.
The following is an episode on Dostoevsky. Me and Laurence talk about Dostoevsky's philosophy, Dostoevsky's theology, his views on Christ, his views on the world, and so much more. Before we get into this video, I'd like to thank all the sponsors who help us on Patreon. And if you would like to help this channel financially as well, then make sure to check out Patreon, which is in the link below. Without further ado, let's get into this video. What are your thoughts about Dostoevsky's view on Christianity as a whole?
I think first one of the major things we have to consider is Dostoevsky's orthodoxy, right? So he has a very strong affinity towards the Orthodox faith, and in particular, I'm reminded of the sort of motifs that are present within Brothers Karamazov, of the priests and the heresium, the monks and such. In particular, that comes to mind is the elder Zosima and his character, and how he almost represents like an epitome of what it means to live a sort of orthodox monkish lifestyle, and the sort of snides as well to like Western forms of Christianity that are found in Dostoevsky that are not necessarily like too like vicious, as it were, especially since we consider every single thing that Dostoevsky says, he always says the opposite, right? So what I mean by this is like how characters like the Grand Inquisitor in Brothers Karamazov, and how even in that story, right? Keep in mind, like we imagine the Grand Inquisitor to be like the worst. Alyosha says he's the worst of the Jesuits, the worst of the Catholics. They're not even that bad, but he happens to be the worst. So he seems to have this sort of interesting idea of this relationship between his more Eastern sort of upbringing in Christianity, and he does seem to try and make the distinction between that and the West. Whether or not he places a value judgment on that is another question.
I think that's a very good place to start off with when you're thinking about Dostoevsky's Christianity, because on one hand you're thinking about his Christianity as perhaps something which is strictly orthodox, and some people say, well, actually he's a purely Christian thinker, and this is where I think a lot of big questions arise, because sometimes I interact with the Dostoevsky subreddit sometimes on Reddit, and one of the things which sometimes they criticize me of is, or they critique my argument is when I say, well, Dostoevsky is fundamentally a challenge not only to the atheist but the Christian as well. I think that's something which is very uniquely Dostoevsky, and is his focus not only to present a strong Christian argument, but perhaps almost his lack of an argument for the Christian position and his strength in emphasizing the atheistic position. And we'll talk a bit more about how he wrestles with the question of Christianity, how one is meant to approach the world in a bit. However, what I do think it ties into what you're saying is that when you're really reading through Dostoevsky's characters and his works, I always find it very fascinating to see where exactly is he coming from, and how are we meant to understand his views on Christianity in relation to orthodoxy, in relationship to Catholicism, perhaps Lutheranism or Protestantism, and also how much of an orthodox thinker should we view Dostoevsky to be? Because he is influenced by the Orthodox Church, but at the same time, is his views completely the same as an orthodox position? Those are things which can be wrestled with, I suppose, and things that can be discussed.
I'm reminded of the critic Leontiev when he says to his friend that he should avoid Dostoevsky's work. Leontiev is an Orthodox Christian, he's very staunchly Orthodox, and his view on Dostoevsky was that Dostoevsky was bordering on heresy in his works, and that any good Orthodox person should avoid it, that he was not able to properly replicate. If not, he was trying to criticize the Orthodox faith. So yes, even within, there was this interesting thing, I'm reminded now of my essay where I was writing about how effectively both Orthodox, socialist, and atheist commentators on Dostoevsky seem to have the same position about him, is that they seem to claim that Dostoevsky is everything that they're not. So the Orthodox Leontiev says that, oh no, he's definitely not an Orthodox Christian. He's something like a socialist and humanitarian, like in his youth with the Petrosevsky circle. Or someone like Shestov says, oh no, he's definitely not a socialist. He's definitely someone who's trying to support Tsarism and traditionalism in Russia. And like the atheist Ermolov says, oh no, he's actually just an Orthodox person. He's trying to uphold the Orthodox Church, and similar to Shestov, he's just trying to add this cruelty to this world that we don't need. So it seems to me that a lot of these commentators on Dostoevsky try and almost like place their almost eisegetical analysis on his work. Eisegetical means that trying to read into his work with their own perspective. They always seem to view Dostoevsky as something that they are not. And I find that quite interesting.
I think one of the things which you could think about, or when you're thinking, why is that almost everyone can find themselves both in and beyond Dostoevsky's characters, is perhaps his almost dialectical way of thinking, especially with his characters. And it's something when you were speaking just now with your first kind of speech or your first discussion about Christianity, was something which came to the back of my mind is Dostoevsky is a dialectical writer. I think there's a wonderful book, I forgot exactly who it is, but it's called The Dialectics of Dostoevsky, or Dostoevsky's Dialectics. And I'll put a link to that in the description below if you want to check it out, but because I can't really remember the name, I'll put the description here as well. But essentially, what I think Dostoevsky does is he does present a lot of different positions within the same book and also tries to find a way to synthesize it. And I suppose The Idiot and the Brothers Karamazov have the strongest presentation of that. So in the Brothers Karamazov, you have the three brothers. You have Ivan, you have Alyosha, and then you have Dmitri. And what it seems to be the case is on one side you have Dmitri, who's this radical atheist, and I wouldn't even call him an atheist, because he doesn't technically metaphysically believe there is no God. In fact, he says, I believe there's God, but I reject the ticket. And we could perhaps discuss about the theistic significance of rejecting the ticket, because I think that's quite significant as well as part of faith. However, what he also does do is he has Ivan on one side, Alyosha on the other side, presenting that Christ-like figure. And in the middle you have Dmitri, who's this really, really wonderful figure, and I think he is not given enough credit. And I think Dostoevsky is most brilliant when he's writing about Dmitri, is that you have his beautiful phrases, even if I went to hell today, Lord, I will still praise you from the pits of hell. And you look at that and you're like, that's completely the antithesis to what Ivan says, in the sense of, well, if I'm going to go to hell, or even if I go to heaven, I'm going to reject the ticket. I'm not going to praise you. And then Dmitri on the other side says, even if I go to hell, I'm going to praise you anyways. And then you have Alyosha, who's definitely never going to go to hell in the first place. I suppose that's the assumption. So there is that kind of synthesis in between those two ideas. And I would say the same thing happens almost, you could say, between Mushkin and Rogozhin in The Idiot. Yes. So you have Mushkin on one side, Rogozhin on the other side, and in the middle you have Nastasia Filiponova, who kind of moves between, who oscillates between those two positions and almost finds his way in the middle. Sometimes she's good, sometimes she's evil. And that also creates kind of, I suppose, a dialectical tendency to that. And I think that's one of the reasons why perhaps a lot of people who are critiquing Dostoevsky are like, well, sometimes they view him, the atheist views him as Alyosha, as Mushkin. The Orthodox, the Christian, views him as the Ivans, the Rogozhins of the world, and all of those things mixed together. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, exactly. The interesting thing is that everyone sees what they don't like in Dostoevsky, or they only see what they do like. But with Dostoevsky, it's like you have both, right? It's almost like an inverse of a Kierkegaardian either or, right? He presents both to you. He says, this is one side. This is your Rogozhins. This is your even Karamazovs. These are Alyoshas, and these are your Mishkins. And he asks you like questions and provides sketches as to how to navigate these characters, these words that are, like, for example, I'm reminded of the arguments of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, how those are almost those vicious intellectual arguments against God, right? I remember when he's sort of mentally traumatizing Sonia concerning like her mother's her mother possibly going to die, and during that whole situation, all Sonia can say is like, "I have faith," and also she's not able to provide anything back. But it is in that is her strength. I'm also like when it comes to these sort of what I might call like these unanswered questions or answered questions, the sort of throughway between these dialectics that Dostoevsky proposes. What do you make of this sort of idea? There are some that might argue that Nietzsche said Dostoevsky was the only psychologist I ever learned from. Now, some have said that Dostoevsky creates questions that only Nietzsche can answer. Does Dostoevsky answer his own questions, or what are we to make of this? Or is Nietzsche even a good answer to these kind of questions?
Ooh, this is a very hard question because the relationship between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche is something which has been written about a lot. And there's this wonderful book by Paolo Stellino about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and a few other ones. Maya Steppenberg also writes between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and the relationship between the two is very interesting. It seems almost that Dostoevsky was a precursor, the prophet to Nietzsche's arguments and ideas, in so much as they both wrestled with very fundamentally similar ideas. They were faced by similar ideas. Yeah, I would not go as far to say that Dostoevsky only raises questions and doesn't raise answers which were only found in Nietzsche. I would say that Dostoevsky provides a question, a challenge, to which Dostoevsky himself answers, and also Nietzsche does indeed attempt to answer those as well. And one of those interesting crossovers is the interpretation of Christ. When you're reading about Walter Kaufmann's analysis of Nietzsche's Christ, he actually attributes the Nietzsche's Christ not to the Christ of the Gospels, rather the Christ of the idiot. And that was a very interesting analysis that Walter Kaufmann presents. And in some sense, he was perhaps thinking that the Christ found in the Antichrist, the Christ found in Nietzsche's works, was that of the true Christian, was that of the idiot, and not one of the Gospels. And that's a very interesting thing that is touched upon as well. So I mean, there are a lot of things which you could talk a lot about between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and I think that would perhaps go way beyond the scope of this podcast episode. Though I do want to raise this question, since we have talked about how certain Orthodox thinkers may not agree with Dostoevsky's conception of Christ and the fact that he borderlines on heresy. How different do you think Dostoevsky's Christ is from the Gospel's Christ?
I think there is a distinction there that Dostoevsky almost wants to move from I don't want to say an orthodox way, but he wants to move from a traditional understanding of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
The traditional interpretations of what's going on in the temptations is like that we should emulate Christ in this regard, that Christ has resisted temptation from Satan, and that we should not seek power, and we should put all faith in him, right? But Dostoevsky, what he does in The Grand Inquisitor is so interesting. He makes a new sort of creation, a new sort of interpretation where freedom becomes the centerpiece. So I'm sort of thinking how the notion that Dostoevsky provides, especially in The Grand Inquisitor, is that what Christ did in the desert when he was tempted by Satan is he ultimately secured freedom. And this is Ivan proposing this notion. Now, whether or not I don't know how to fully say if Dostoevsky supported that notion, but what I can sort of see is that he's placed this argument that why would Christ do something like this? He seems almost perplexed. This is something weird. It's not something we can just say like, oh, there's an easy sort of traditional answer to this through some interpretation of what's going on there. This is something odd. It seems reasonable, and what Ivan, I guess, rather than Dostoevsky, seems to suggest is that what the church and Christianity has done so far is to rectify that mistake, right? So he's almost taking a sort of two guns. You've got one gun to the gospel writer saying, why did you make Christ do that? You got another gun to the modern church saying, why did you change what Christ did? And I don't know fully if I would say Dostoevsky is actually the one holding that gun, but he's definitely raising the challenge, raising the question. Now, the thing I'd like to ask in response to that is to say, like, how far does Alyosha's kiss solve that situation?
I think Alyosha's kiss is very symbolic because it does represent the last scene. It does mirror, in some sense, the last scene of Ivan's story. And in some sense, one could almost make the further argument, that this is perhaps the only time in Dostoevsky's works I can think of where both the protagonist and the antagonist kind of merge together on one certain solution. You have Alyosha mimicking the kiss, which almost could be interpreted as, I agree with your story, in the sense of, and this is just an interpretation that I'm purporting, and it might not be the correct one, but I do think it is something to note when you have Alyosha mimicking the actions of Christ. It's almost to say, well, I agree with you in some sense, and what I think is fascinating is that kiss. There's the kiss of the betrayal of Judas to Christ in the Gospels, of course, and then you have that kiss of love, and it could almost show that kiss has so many different meanings, yet at the same time it has this fundamental kind of torn where almost the story, the kiss, that understanding of perhaps the truth of the situation is a rectification of the kiss found in the Gospels, where Judas betrays Christ, and now the full understanding of Christ has been returned. And I'm not sure how much you read into that, but I definitely do think that, at least from my perspective, this is the area within the whole of Dostoevsky's corpus where I think you could almost be most certain that it is Dostoevsky holding both of those guns, and that is at least my interpretation of it.
Yeah, you talk about truth as well. That's really interesting. I mean, Dostoevsky said he preferred Christ over truth. Now, this is a really interesting statement because, Pilate asks, what is truth? Christ says, I am truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. What's interesting is that, does Dostoevsky make a bifurcation between Christ and truth? Or is he saying that Christ is superior to truth and that truth is merely part of it? Or what's the relationship there? Because, I do think, now you convinced me that I think, it would be Dostoevsky holding both of those guns. But the second question I would ask is, would he actually shoot those guns? Would he actually sort of see these things as, what's his, does he see these things as actually true? And if so, even if he was to shoot those guns and say, oh, this is true, the Gospels, you're weird, and the church, you're doing something wrong, what would that actually mean? What would that mean? Would that say that Dostoevsky is something as Leontiev argued that he was? Or how would you sort of answer this?
That's a very interesting question, a very difficult one at that. I think he does shoot the gun against the Catholic Church, because he does create quite powerful rants against the Catholic Church in almost every single one of his books. I would say that this is perhaps his strongest and most brilliantly written criticism of Catholicism. I think it's perhaps the strongest criticism of Catholicism that I've ever come across. I don't think any other argument against Catholicism just as well matches up to Catholicism, because it almost argues against Catholicism as a psychological problem, instead of actually saying, oh, the truth claims and doctrine of the Catholic Church are wrong, which I think that's the approach of the Protestants, but I think that approach is just horrifically problematic, and I'm trying not to be biased when I'm saying that, but I do think that the approach from psychology against the Catholic Church is perhaps the strongest one, so I do think he does shoot that gun off. But at the same time, when you're looking at the Gospel writers, I think perhaps you could say almost some sense that he is approaching the Gospels in some form of, he looks at them as extremely perplexing texts, and he accepts the radical, almost ridiculousness of the text, and what he's trying to do is to accept, and he does what great literature and great writers do, is to analyze the text found in front of him and provide his own interpretation of it, take the conclusions to their furthest degree. And what Dostoevsky says is, well, we've taken the conclusion to its furthest degree, now I'm going to hold on to that radical conclusion that I've reached. And I think that's perhaps his answer with the truth, and we could perhaps develop more about what does he mean by Christ and the truth, and we could turn it into phenomenology that I was talking. Yes. I said the text to you prior to this podcast, but But I do think that he is affirming that the perplexing nature of the gospel writers and say, well, this might not fit very well, but I think it is something he's saying, well, perhaps it is a path that we can indeed pursue, and that's something which he is trying to purport. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I really do think Dostoevsky is quite perplexed. I think he's very confused a lot of the time, but not in a bad way. Not that he's unclear or he is lacking in faith or something like that. But he has questions, and he is trying to posit them in such a way that the answers that he will provide and the answers that he does genuinely believe in, that is the answers of Christianity and the Orthodox Church, of Christ over truth, the answers meet a sufficient challenge. So I think just as much as Dostoevsky might provide a great challenge to the Catholic Church, he just provides a great challenge. I extend it even further. He provides a great challenge to Christianity overall. His arguments against Christianity within his characters, like Raskolnikov or like Ivan Karamazov, represent some really serious questions. They are like Ivan's development of the problem of evil in Mutiny before the Grand Inquisitor is quite astounding. Like the way that he sort of molds Alyosha into just like entering this fit of despair as he lists like crime upon crime that God has let happen. Like the thing that sticks to mind especially is the child being mauled by dogs, which apparently happened in real life. It was a newspaper story during that time. So I guess like I think Dostoevsky wants to provide serious challenges and questions which suggests that he is somewhat perplexed and confused in himself about why is this actually happening? Why does God allow evil, for example? Or why does the church treat Christ the way it does, especially the Catholic Church? But the answers that he provides, the dialectics that he's formed, show even more genius in how to resolve the perplexity and absurdity that is present, that he might present within the Christian faith. And I think for me, this all comes into the notion of actions. The kiss of Alyosha, the sort of Grushenka's refusal to have sex with Alyosha and hug onion in hell sort of analogy. The confession of Raskolnikov, him falling down upon the ground and saying pieces by him, claiming himself as a murderer. These sort of things, these sort of very visible acts, the acts of faith, do so much more than the words of Ivan or Raskolnikov pre-confession. Like, and I think this is where the existential part really comes in, because we're moving away from trying to understand, well, religion, faith, Christianity, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, as sort of these arguments with which you can attack like premises include, sort of like how you're describing sort of Protestant criticism of Catholicism, that there are sort of conditions upon which we can sort of criticize. What Dostoevsky is really getting down to is how do we be this phenomenology, as you say? How do you be a Christian? How do you be an Orthodox when these things provide genuine problems? And his answers, the actions that these characters do, they all surmount to this sort of notion of what I think is the centerpiece of Dostoevsky's entire sort of philosophy. And I think it's love. It seems so like saccharine and almost like kind of cringe if you for some people. Like I can imagine loads of people like, oh, love, oh. But I think really the centerpiece of all of Dostoevsky's work is centered around love. and what it means to be full of it,
Mm.
and what it means to lack of it in great destitution.
Mm.
The person that really comes to mind here is the underground man.
Mm-hmm.
He is a person so lacking in love, so lacking in care for other human beings that, like, it's just astounding that a person can even imagine something like this.
Mm.
And yet, what he provides in that book is that sort of really horrific picture of humanity, and yet Dostoevsky wants to show us that love is truly present in this world and that it can almost save us from hell. And this is, I think, related to Christ. Like, Christ is love. And regardless of what things may seem, the Holder Zosuma's body rotting at his funeral, despite things may seeming almost in darkness and destitution, the love that Zosuma had for Alyosha is the one that lives, not his body.
Yeah.
The love that Christ has for humanity is the one that lives, not these perplexing questions that the Grand Inquisitor has. And the love that Sonia, the love that even Razumikin has for Raskolnikov beats everything that Raskolnikov has to say to justify himself. I think that would probably be my belief in like the centerpiece of what Dostoevsky is trying to get at.
I definitely agree with you, because love is something which is so fascinating, so profoundly deep, I suppose, in Dostoevsky. And one of those things which comes to my mind, I suppose, and what struck me most about attending Catholic Mass when I first attended it, not all those years ago, but just at the start of Michaelmas, was the crucifix. And I think the crucifix is something which stands out to me very powerfully in union with the idea of love and Dostoevsky's theology, because one of Dostoevsky's, I think, the scenes which stood out most to me, apart from the Grand Inquisitor, was the scene in which Mushkin turns to Rogozhin at the painting in his house and says that painting is so dreadful that it could make someone lose their faith. And likewise, actually, I was sitting in this room, and you can see there's a crucifix behind me over there. I was sitting on my bed with another one of Andrew's friends, and he looked at the crucifix, and he said almost a very similar thing to Mushkin. He says, I never understood why Catholics would put that crucifix there, because why on earth would anyone want people to see something so gruesome, something so terrible? And I think the answer is very similar as well. It's the idea that, yes, that thing is very gruesome. Yes, that scene, the idea of the crucifix, can be so powerful to make someone lose their faith. However, it is also the greatest demonstration of love. It is that greatest centerpiece. It is that, going back to Christ is the way in which everyone can understand the suffering. Not necessarily overcome it. The suffering is going to be there. But it is his phenomenological answer to evil. It's his answer to the problem of atheism. It's his answer that why does Christ, in some sense, is more important than the truth? Is because by adopting Christ into your life, you're able to, I suppose, view that evil. You're able to view that suffering. That suffering then means something. You look at Christ on the cross, the crucifix, in Mass, and that's, I think, the most powerful part of the entire service. You're kneeling to the cross, is that on that cross is the representation of the suffering that encapsulates all the suffering in the world. And in some sense, that suffering, no matter where you are, no matter who you are, when you're approaching that cross, the suffering within your soul is able to be tied to the suffering on the cross, and you're like saying, that love for me is immense and powerful, and that love tied into the suffering is what makes it worth it. Even if I'm going through, I suppose in Psalm, I forgot 23, I think, even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. And it's that idea of looking at that cross and saying, I am going through great suffering, but that suffering absolves the suffering of my shoulders, because I am one with your suffering, and God is suffering there with me. And that is something I think is so powerful with Dostoevsky's perspection of Christ, and it is also the reason why, going back to our previous point where we say Christ is, I would rather be with Christ than the truth, is that Christ is the only part, or the only way in which you can truly have a correct phenomenological view of the world.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, yeah. I remember, like, there are a few things I had to say about this. The first thing I thought was, like, as a child, I used to be very terrified of the crucifix. Like my mum would make me do the sign of the cross before every church, but every time I'd see it, I'd do the sign of the cross, of course, but I'd see the massive crucifix outside the cathedral, as I turned my head away because I thought it was so gruesome and scary. But as I grew older, it is almost something that represents the greatest form of love and sacrifice that any person on earth, now past, present, and future, could ever do, is to bear the world's sins upon that cross and be able to save us all. I think this is something that Dostoevsky finds incredibly compelling, and I find it incredibly compelling as well. I think the the sort of there's this scene I remember from Peter Ustinov's um, series on Russia, where he's interviewing an actor who's playing Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky says this very interesting thing. He says, "Everyone needs something to believe in, and what better example than Jesus Christ?" And that sort of statement like resounded through my soul because I'm just thinking like, yes, it's his. There is no other better example, and I think the key word here is example. It's not even about like arguments and sort of the circles we can and the sort of holes we dig ourselves into as we try and raise the price in a sort of very David Lewis kind of way. Raise the price of how, or lower the price even of our beliefs. For Dostoevsky, it doesn't seem like it's about paying a price. I mean, you have the ticket, right? I wouldn't pay the price, you know. It's Mitya who provides the succinct answer to that, where like it doesn't matter about the price. I still believe it anyway. And we see, and he seems to sort of sketch out this sort of paradoxes of faith, the paradoxes of what it means to live, the paradoxes of suffering, and he creates these narratives which so eloquently provide examples of these, and so eloquently provide explanations which seem to all thread through Christ. Whether it be a Christ-like figure like Michigan or Alyosha, or whether it be Jesus Christ himself in the Grand Inquisitor. Dostoevsky has such a powerful relationship to Christ that I think really like hammers in his both literary skill, of course, but his truly edifying nature. And this is where like I cannot find myself agreeing with Shestov, Ermilov, or Leontiev on their views on Dostoevsky. They see him merely as sort of like a prophet for a certain group. He's the prophet of the Petroshevsky circle. He's trying to take down the Tsar. He's a prophet of the Orthodox Church, and he's trying to enforce traditionalist uh, explanation. He's trying to be regressive. He's trying to uh, get rid of all this stuff, this French Revolution stuff, get rid of liberalism stuff. He may be doing that. He may not be. I don't really care. I don't think Dostoevsky cares either. I mean, maybe it's too harsh to say that, but what I do care when I read Dostoevsky is his treatment of these characters and how the light of Christ shines so effortlessly through some of them. When, like, you just see how Alyosha is described, the way he walks around, it's almost astounding how you can create a character so Christ-like and so not Christ himself. He doesn't go so far to say that. He doesn't go. I think that's the interesting part about why he makes Christ so mute. It's probably not the only reason, but it's one of the interesting things that I might think about. The reason why he says Christ, why Ivan makes Christ mute in the Grand Inquisitor, because what he can't say anything. He can't put words into his mouth. He only the Gospels are the only ones permitted to do that, really. But what he does do with these characters, with Alyosha in particular, I'm just the lament he feels after Zosima's death, and of the sort of strength he has to sort of walk around everywhere trying to fix the mess that his father and brothers are trying to get into. It's almost it's just beautiful, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's in that sort of beauty that Leontiev, Shestov, Ermolov, anybody that tries to say that Dostoevsky is the sort of prophet of X sort of belief, he's not really trying to be a prophet, I don't think. He's trying to provide serious questions and create a sort of phenomenology of what it is to be in this relationship with Christ. And in that way, he really represents, I know, a very ridiculous man. It's incredibly ridiculous what he does. When I say like these things like confusing, ridiculous, insane, it's not in a sort of derogatory sense at all. It's praising him for his ridiculousness. It's only in such ridiculousness. It's only by being so ridiculous that one can have so much power. I think the best way to put this all to ground might be these two words. He's a holy fool.
Yes. I think when we're talking about the holy fool, and when we're talking about what it means to be Christ-like, and you raise the word ridiculous, and I think that's such a beautiful thing, because I was talking to one of our dear friends, Rose, recently, and well, actually, this was quite a while back. I think it was in Michaelmas term, and she was talking to me, and she noted, you like to use the word ridiculous a lot. And I agreed with her. I said, yes, ridiculous is a word that I use a lot in my heart. It's a word I carry on my shoulders quite a lot. I think it's very easy in the world today to view ridiculous as a negative idea. That, you have to try to... And in some sense, I think this is where ridiculous and stupidity kind of do not overlap. Ridiculous, on one hand, is almost to go countercultural. Is to do things which people do not expect. Being stupid is just to do things which are completely, utterly nonsensical, I suppose. Yeah. But ridiculous takes it even further. And I think the greatest character for that is Mushkin. Definitely. And when you're thinking about Mushkin, Dostoevsky calls Mushkin a failed project. And we could delve into that in a bit. But I think Mushkin represents a very strange depiction of Christ. One which I think is very, very profound and something which really stands out when you're thinking about what does it mean to be Christ. Because a lot of people like to present Christ as this king, a conquering king, I suppose. Eschatologically, and everyone looks at the Gospels, it's a meek servant and whatnot, but Christ is this victor, someone who has power. Luke's somewhat higher Christology and whatnot, and of course John, people will look at that and go, oh my gosh, it's Docetism. I'm going into figure of Jesus now. Let's move away from it.
No Ernest Kazimir present here.
Yes, but with Mushkin, you have a complete flipping around of things. He's trying to create a Christ-like figure. That Christ-like figure is presented through this sense of, well, I am trying to serve. But he takes serving other people to almost such an extreme degree that service that he has is so ridiculous. And that's the only word I could put it. It's the only word which comes into my mind. How else can you describe Mushkin's acts to the world? People use him, people take advantage of him. And perhaps in that sense, Dostoevsky might have looked at that and said, well, Christ surely wasn't being taken advantage of in that sense. But at the same time, my reading of The Idiot, and this is, of course, when I say this, I'm just reading into Dostoevsky. I don't necessarily think this is what Dostoevsky was intending. But perhaps you viewed Mushkin as someone who knew what was going on around him. That he knew that people were taking advantage of him. That he knew that he couldn't save the people that he was trying to care about. With that supposition in mind, I do think you actually do get a Christ-like figure. Because you have Christ going to the cross, knowing who is going to be saved and who's not. And I'm not talking about predestination here, but he does know that most people would perhaps not be open to his message unless you're a universalist. But he knows of the suffering, he knows of the people who would turn away from him, yet he still goes to the cross anyways. He still decides to carry the sins of the world on his shoulders, despite knowing the consequences, the good and evil of the actions. He knows, he comes into the world knowing that a lot of religious wars will be fought in his name, which are not right. He knows all the... Has my computer completely crashed? No, it's still going. He knows all of these possible conclusions, yet he still does it anyways.
Yeah.
And in some sense, I think that is the ridiculous nature that is being presented by Dostoevsky, and I would say that is what makes it not a failed project, but rather a successful one. What do you think?
I would like to ask this question. Would you say that Mushkin... I don't know, I haven't fully read The Idiot, to be fair, but does he say, or would he say, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing? Would you think that he sort of has an idea of that in his mind, or is he... What do you make of that? Do you think he has that sort of Markan notion?
Ooh. I mean, there's always that point of saying, does anyone dare say, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing? It's, in some sense, I think, if I remember correctly, Stephen says that in Acts, does he not? Or So,
he says that
so in some sense, there is that ability. And I think Mushkin does... He does accept, he does embody that notion, I think, at the end of The Idiot, and hopefully I'm not spoiling it for you.
It's alright.
But he does forgive Rogojin at the end, and I wouldn't say what he's forgiving it for, but I mean, those who read the book know what is being forgiven for and what not. But he does have that forgiveness for other people, and I think he does embody that. He does embody that quite powerfully.
That's interesting, because like I'm just starting out The Idiot right now. I just got it from the library like a week ago. It is probably, out of the big Dostoevsky books, it's the one I haven't actually fully read. But yeah, like the questions that I sort of have when I was just beginning that book are, yeah, the way that Mushkin sort of like, I don't like, I remember when he sees that picture of Nastasia Philippova, I'm just like, he just is just in love. It's quite forward thinking in a way to our modern generation, and how like we can always just see a picture of someone and then almost imagine the whole reality at that point. So yeah, one of the questions that I guess I have concerning Michigan is that, in what ways would you say that, what do you mean by how this, what do you mean by failed project exactly? I got a hint of it earlier concerning like, is Michigan truly Christ-like? What do you precisely mean by what do you mean by Dostoevsky meaning by failed projects?
If you've been enjoying the videos so far, make sure to like and subscribe. These videos make a long time to prepare, to read, and research for, so it'll mean a lot to us if you show your support there. Let us know in the comments what other videos you want to talk about, and also if you want to support our channel financially, make sure to check out our Patreon. The link is in the description below, but of course that is completely optional. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let's carry on with it. And this comes from his letters. I think it's his letter to his brother, if I remember correctly. It's a long time since I've read Dostoevsky's letters, but essentially what he's trying to say is, when he's writing The Idiot, he says, this is the hardest work I've ever written so far, and he in some sense wished he would have redone a lot of parts in it, and that he felt it was perhaps too rushed. And in one sense, what you're thinking about this idea of the Christ-like figure is to actually think about what he was inspired by when he was writing The Idiot, and parts of that element of that is found in one of his letters as well, when he says, well, the most Christian novel in history is Don Quixote. And that, you look at that and you're like, how is Don Quixote a Christ-like figure? The guy's absolutely ridiculous. He runs into a brothel and says he's saving 3 princesses, right? Like it takes the idea of ridiculousness to a whole new level, where it legitimately, I would say, borderlines on almost stupidity. But he looks at that and says that's the most Christ-like figure in history, and you could almost say that when he's writing The Idiot, he is trying to write a Don Quixote-esque character, yet wants to add his own twist to it, just as like perhaps when writing The Grand Inquisitor, he looks at the temptations of Christ and adds his own twist to it, I suppose. So, and I suppose from that perspective, you could potentially view the idea that Dostoevsky perhaps wasn't too happy with his interpretation of Don Quixote and the Gospels. Perhaps he wasn't too happy with the way he presented that ridiculousness, and thought there were other ways in which it could have been encapsulated but taken perhaps either further or less far. And I'm not really sure about how to consider that. I mean, some people would say that it was a failed project not because of it being not because it was failed philosophically, but rather because it was just failed literally as a novel. The novel was just horrible, and there's a few people say that The Idiot is the worst novel Dostoevsky has ever written, and I disagree with that, but it is something that people have written. There was this really wonderful, I think it was someone's PhD thesis, who compares Don Quixote and Mushkin. I really forget the name of it, but one of them is a monophonic and the other one's like they have different presentations of the character, just in the sense that Mushkin is just so one-sided that it's just not a good literary character at all.
Yeah.
I will try to find a link to that, and I'll put that in the description below as well, so you can check it out. But that's definitely one way to approach it, a failed project. But I'm not too sure about how one can wrestle with the idea of a failed project, I suppose.
That's very interesting. Yes, both from a literary and theological point of view. Because I guess that's where we're sort of arguing here. We're sort of in the sort of crossroads of what makes a good novel and what makes a good depiction of Christ. And I guess another question here, this goes beyond the India, I guess, is how well, I mean, it's something that I think is quite well, I imagine you think it's quite well, but how well do you think Dostoevsky tries to present, this is in particular, the historical Christ, keeping in mind the sorts of questions of liberal theology at the time? So liberal theology is a movement which was occurring during the 1800s, led by the Tübingen School and Friedrich Schleiermacher, which was attempting to try and go on this quest for the historical Jesus, this truth, as it were, the truth of what lies behind Jesus, whether that be symbolic, as someone like David Friedrich Strauss argues, or just pure lies, like Reimarus argues. How far do you think Dostoevsky is engaging with those sort of arguments there?
Well, I think if you're looking at that presentation, there was two lives of Jesus as written, one by David Friedrich Strauss and another one by So essentially, Dostoevsky was quite touched by Renan's rendition of the life of Jesus, and what I think is being presented here is that while he does recognize the historical reality of Jesus, I think that's undeniable. At the same time, I would say he almost relegates that question to a secondary question, to say that it is real in a fundamental sense, that to try to reduce it to symbology on one hand would be incorrect, and to try to reduce it completely to history would also be incorrect. Because I think there is that problem of saying something is historical and then stopping it at that, because, of course, in Notes from Underground, he writes very strongly against this scientific materialism view, or this scientific deterministic view about the Crystal Palace in Notes from Underground. And I think that you could almost make the same case for history as well, in the sense that if everything is historical and everything, I suppose, follows a Hegelian perspective of like this absolute spirit moving towards an end of history. Of course, that's a very brief overview of what Hegel thought, but if you follow that perspective, I think Dostoevsky would disagree with that perspective of history, of the life of Jesus, and viewing Jesus completely historically as well. So I think it is somewhere in between those two lines.
Okay, that's interesting, because I remember also reading this master's thesis by a person called Mitchell. She basically argued in that thesis that Dostoevsky's Jesus was a direct attack on the sort of Straussian notions of basically the symbolic Jesus. Can you explain more a bit on how Dostoevsky develops a sort of symbolic Jesus, and what that actually means to go further than the historical Jesus?
Well, I think that the symbolic Jesus is almost, when I say Jesus is symbolic, I think, to put it more precisely, is to say that Jesus is archetypal. In the way that a Jesus figure can be created and repurposed to exist in multiple different ages. And that cannot purely be done by history, because history, by definition, determines, or at least presents, a certain picture of truth about a certain event in the world.
Yeah.
So when you're saying, well, Jesus to Dostoevsky was historical, you're saying, well, Jesus in the gospel said these words, he said these parables, he did these things in reference to these Pharisees, these Sadducees and whatnot. But to say that Jesus was symbolic is to say that Jesus represents an ideal which can go beyond the mere actions in history and can be taken out of that context and be reintegrated into further contexts throughout history and in different times. And I'll say that is what goes beyond history. Now, of course, you could say, I'm looking at a historical figure. That story in history has significance, and that could still remain strictly historical. And that could be an argument. You could say that's a broader definition or a looser definition or weaker definition of historical Jesus. But to be able to take that out of his time, and if not completely reinvent a Christ-like figure in the body of Mushkin, in the body of Alyosha, or to view Christ in the body of perhaps Don Quixote, is to recognize that Christ is an archetype and symbols could be made out of him, or images of Christ could be made out of that symbol. And I think it is that second element which does arise.
Okay, that's super interesting. Because the question of historical and symbolic really is interesting with regards to literature in general and how literature treats people like Jesus. The thing that immediately comes to mind is C.S. Lewis's Aslan. How does, we're not going to go into Lewis too much here, but we definitely see that in literature, the relationship between the sort of historical source material, the truth as it were, and the symbolism, the archetypes, maybe the better word to use, that's generated from that source material, the relationship between that. In Dostoevsky, yeah, I would agree. I think ultimately it does serve to an edifying purpose, that Dostoevsky is trying to praise God in his work, and he's trying to provide situations which show that in foolishness, St. Paul says this very succinctly, our wisdom is God's foolishness, right? And maybe in sort of the inverse way, our foolishness may in fact show God's full power. Would you sort of see like someone like Alyosha as being able to sort of give up those things, give up the sort of his reasoning powers and hand it over to God? Like, I think the thing that comes into mind is like when he has that doubt after Zosima's death, and he's trying to reckon with that, and he's taken advantage by Rakitin, who tries to make him break his monastic vows, Grushenka. Do you think that, number one, I guess we can finish off with this. Like, does Dostoevsky provide these sort of how far does Dostoevsky make these archetypes, and what differences do they have? I guess this sort of like ties in everything like to the sort of historical Jesus. And secondly, does in the characters in particular Alyosha and Mushkin, does Dostoevsky really portray them as fully foolish?
I think those are two very difficult questions, and I'll answer the first one about the relationship between Dostoevsky's archetypes and Jesus, and I think the connection can be drawn, and the connection must be drawn. However, it's very difficult to view them as full, complete archetypes of Christ and have almost detach it from its original mission to say, well, this project was Dostoevsky's attempt to recreate Christ in our times. I think that's perhaps a stretch too far. I think what he's trying to do is to create a question in which you would ask yourself, would Christ have acted in that way? To help your understanding of Christ. The question is to say, well, this is somewhat Christ-like. But what attributes of that character are Christ-like and what other attributes are not? What areas can we learn from Christ? Are we Alyosha interacting with Christ? Because of course there is that problem of well, Alyosha is himself a Christ-like archetypal figure, and the same goes to Mushkin. Yet, at the same time, those figures are also wrestling with the idea of Christ found in the book. So Mushkin looks at the painting of Christ while being a Christ-like archetype, looking at the Christ in flesh, the historical Jesus. And in some sense, you could look at that and say, well, that is the symbolism, that is the symbolic Mushkin looking at the historical Christ, the symbolic Christ looking at the historical Christ. What would that symbolic Christ would have thought about the historical Christ? That could be a way to look at it. There's a mix between those two ideas, and it's something which I suppose is a very personal reading, I'd say. And in some sense, I think this is where, I mean, to give postmodernism its due, is that when you're approaching fiction, there is that openness for interpretation. And I will go as far to say that almost every single interpretation that you get can potentially be a correct one. Perhaps not objectively true in the sense of that is what Dostoevsky meant to say, but it could create something which is equally valid for the individual approaching the literature, the story. I think that's perhaps not an absolute answer to your question about Dostoevsky's Archetypes in Jesus, but I think it somewhat gets there, I would say. And the question of whether Mushkin and Alyosha represent that holy fool or fully represent that, I don't know at times. I would say it's that idea of that state of acceptance is something which is very difficult to comprehend, I would say, and a state, and to what degree is that acceptance embodied, and to what degree is that state of acceptance, I suppose, I don't know, necessitated by his interaction with other people. How much is that almost, what is being called, is Alyosha acting out of himself, or is Mushkin acting out of himself, or is he acting in that way as a result of other people's reactions and relationships to him? And I think that's an interesting question. You talk about Grushenko, you talk about Nastasia, you talk about Rogojin. These people are eliciting or taking actions or reactions out of Mushkin. They're bringing out actions out of Alyosha. How much do we read that into or in accordance with his presentation as a holy fool? Those things, I suppose, is quite a complex web as well. But
we need another episode
definitely
to ask those questions.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's a very good place to end off this video, is that idea that Mushkin and Dostoevsky's Christ and Dostoevsky in general is just such a complex figure. And as it comes with all of these questions and all of these podcasts, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you want us to discuss next in the next installment of Existential Talks podcast. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching. If you do want to support this channel, then go check out our Patreon. Or if you don't want to support us financially, that's completely fine as well. Like and subscribe. It means a lot to us. And share this episode with your friends as well. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching. God bless and goodbye. I'll see you next one.